Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. First, I want to start off by just thanking everyone for subscribing. I can't believe that I made it over 1,000 subscribers. Wow, I didn't imagine that this would actually happen. You know, it's a very niche channel, we're talking about sample libraries and my own music and stuff, so it's definitely not for the general public, but it's really cool to see that there's enough of you that are interested and that are supportive enough to subscribe, so I just wanted to really thank you for that. And I wanted to give a quick shout out to my family. They have congratulated me and have gifted me a new lens, a 16mm 2.8 from Canon RF mount. It's super back-ordered, so it's gonna be forever until I actually get it, but thank you to my family. I also want to thank you guys for giving me so many different suggestions on what kind of tests I should do, to the point that I'm kind of overwhelmed and I probably won't get to all of it. But yeah, thank you for commenting down on YouTube and Facebook on the different forums and showing interest. I will get to other videos doing other things, but today I'm just so curious, how many Kontakt instances can my new computer take? So the current setup right now, just so you guys know, I am running a 4K Samsung 32-inch monitor going through USB-C at 30 frames per second, 30 Hertz frequency, not video frame rate. I am on Logic 10.7.1, the update came out like a couple days ago, so I am running this in Rosetta mode because I believe Kontakt only runs in Rosetta. I mean, technically it does run natively as well, but it's not officially supported, I believe. And I'm monitoring audio through my audio interface with headphones. So my buffer size is currently 1024, so I can get maximum performance, and for a lot of people doing MIDI work, this is what their setting is, even if you have like one of those huge cheese grater MacBooks. Always good to give yourself a nice big buffer size, unless you're recording something that really needs fine latency response or no latency response. The computer basically has all of its apps turned off. I do have Safari still on. Yeah, I think that's everything you guys need to know. So let's hop straight in and see what we can do with this computer. So what I've done right now is I have loaded basically onto every track of my template a short, long phrase just on whatever C is comfortable in their register. So it's like short, long. And I basically copied and pasted that through all of the tracks. Yeah, so currently I have, let's see how many tracks I actually have loaded up, or not loaded up yet. So I will have 213 instances of Kontakt if I get all of this loaded up and playing. So this first test is, can I even do that? Is it even possible to load up 213 instances of Kontakt? Each instrument, has some differences. If we start by looking at, this instance of the Berlin Woodwinds Piccolo, I am using the Babylon Waves articulation set system, which means for something like Berlin or something like Spitfire strings or other Spitfire libraries, I have multiple patches loaded in one instance of Kontakt, except everything is purged, so only the articulations I will be using will be used. And of course, each instrument has a different footprint. Some of this Berlin stuff and something like Spitfire chamber strings is going to be a lot heavier than something like Aaron Venture Infinite Brass. As I was setting this up, I was basically only loading in the MIDI and checking a couple of patches to make sure I had everything in the right place, but I never tried loading everything in. So test one, if this passes, I'm gonna throw some harder things at it, but I mean, even if this passes, I'm gonna be super happy because it's basically everything I need. It's all the Kontakt instances in my template, and if it runs, then, personally, I don't even need to test it further other than just to see how far it can go. So without further ado, let's start loading in these instruments and see if this actually works. I'm gonna go ahead and load in all of the Berlin. I don't have anything in this because this is more of a sketching tool. Load in the Cinewind stuff. This is Cinewinds Pro. Gonna load in Spitfire Studio Woodwinds. Let's hear the Woodwinds. Not it. Interesting. So it took a while to start. That might have just been because the instruments were loading up, although it didn't even show the little swirling Kontakt loading window. But I don't think I've seen that on this new Mac, so maybe it's not a thing on the new operating system. Let's try it again. Yeah, so this time there was no delay after I pressed the spacebar, other than Logic compensating for some of the pre-delays I have set up. I can load in all of my woodwinds and have it play no problem, which is really impressive because with 16 gigabytes, I could barely load all of my Berlin instruments. Okay, starting out, memory, we are at 45 gigs used and 18 gigs in cache. This may seem ridiculously heavy, but basically the more RAM you have, the more the computer will just fill it up and not use any swap, and it's going to take advantage of that headroom. Now, I'm interested to see at what point we're going to start hitting close to 64 gigs of RAM, and then at what point we're going to see swap data being used. All right, moving on, let's add in the strings. First of all, my favorite Cinematic Studio strings, chamber strings. Let me just solo the strings and see if this is playing properly. Beautiful. Could use more vibrato, but I'm too lazy to go in and fix that. Okay, now I'm going to load in Spitfire symphonic strings. Yeah, nice lush string sound now with the woodwinds. Nice. Just going to bring up the CPU meter as well so we can see what's happening there. Again, with 16 gigs of RAM, it would be kind of heavy to even load Cinematic Studio string stuff alone. And then if I were to want to layer it with another string library, I would probably freeze something and then do that. Already, I am super impressed. This is totally workable and much better than my previous setup. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and load in Spitfire solo strings on top of it. Beautiful. How much more string libraries could you use? Like, do you need all these libraries? No. A lot of these libraries I got earlier on, regretted it, and then bought something else that I preferred. Of course, they do have their perks, and each of them I use in different contexts. So it's nice to have, but it's not necessary. We are at apparently 56.5 gigabytes of RAM. Logic is using 41 gigs of RAM. What else do we have? Screen capture is taking up a bit of RAM. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and turn off Dropbox, Creative Cloud, Mega. I will leave Google Drive on because I do kind of rely on it. Better Touch tool we don't need right now. All right, let's continue on. I would never need to load all of these string libraries at once, of course, but now we're gonna add Cinestrings solo. Okay, let's see if Cinestrings is actually playing. Okay. Interesting. I have this soloed, but the CPU is spiking quite a bit. Let's try playing everything together. Okay, so the CPU seems to be maxing out before the RAM does. If this was a more elaborate arrangement, perhaps this wouldn't actually work. Interesting. Okay, we're going to move on to the brass and see how far we go though. Cinematic Studio brass all at once. Let's get that loaded in. I'm going to solo it. We get the Beach Ball of Doom again. Okay. System overload. Okay, going to give it another try. So while I did have a system overload because the CPU was peaking, after just kind of letting Logic settle into it, it seems to be working again. RAM, we are at 57 gigs. We're still good. It's still workable. Let's see how many tracks I am actually using right now. That is 72 tracks. So 72 instances of Kontakt playing all at once, switching at least one articulation between a short and a long, seems to be maxing out the CPU first. That's kind of disappointing to see, honestly. The CPU, despite being on the highest buffer setting and using an audio interface, it might be partially because of the CPU. At some point, I am going to turn off the screen recording and just rely on having purely Logic be open. Anyways, here is Cinebrass Pro. Get the Rainbow of Doom again. Okay, you can see that all the cores are working hard. And again, everything. Nope. System overload. Try again. Nope. System overload, okay. So it seems that these extra 11 tracks are a little too hard on it. Okay, what if I were to loop this? Okay, once I'm looping it, it seems to be working. So it seems that stress testing this so far, it's not the RAM that's an issue, it's the CPU. And I'm only using 2 articulations. If I switch between more often, I can see that it could be a bit of an issue. Okay, now I have a mixture of infinite brass in the French horns, sample modeling, angry brass, and heroic horns, all Kontakt instruments. Oh, there was a bit of a dropout there. Yeah, you can see 4 cores are being maxed out as I start to play this. Yikes. Let's try everything again. Looks like we're at the limit. Yeah, don't think I'm gonna get any further than that actually. Let me try unloading these. Quick tip, if you press Alt and then press the power button, it actually unloads from RAM rather than just disabling the track. It's always nice to have if you're constantly freezing stuff or needing to do that. Yeah, we're still system overload. Yeah. So we're barely able to play that. Let's see, how many tracks are we at? 89 instances of Kontakt. Interesting. 89 instances of Kontakt is not a lot. Most of the time you're not going to be using 89 instances of Kontakt loaded up. And each instance here is actually every articulation of that patch loaded up, rather than doing individual articulations. So I am curious to see what it's going to be like if I don't use the articulation patches and I just have individual articulations to do this. I bet I will get a lot more instances of Kontakt actually working, because each instance here is way too heavy on the CPU, probably because it's just keeping track of everything and switching between the articulations. Interesting. I think we'll have to call it a day on this session. Let's try a new session now. By the way, so far battery life and fan noise has been amazing. Running that stress test, the fans were at 0 RPM if you saw at the top of the screen, which is insane. At that point, you know, at that heavy RAM and CPU, the fan wasn't even running. Touching the computer right now, it's not even warm. A couple days ago when we were doing our first recording session at NYU doing a string quartet recording, I took the computer to school for the first time and I was working on a history paper and running other things, Google, a bunch of YouTube videos, a lot of PDF resources, Sibelius for transcriptions and stuff. I was writing a film history paper on Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I used it basically from 9 to I think around 5 or 6, kind of on and off, not constantly. But at the end of the day, there was still 55% of battery left, which is fantastic. If I was running my other computer, it probably would have gone from 100 to 0 like 2 times in that time. And then I decided not to charge it overnight and then take it to school again the next day and see how long I could actually use the battery. I was still writing my paper, and then there was another recording session that was remote that day. I wasn't in it, but I wanted to watch. So I had Zoom turned on and Audio Mover turned on, along with all of my transcription, Microsoft Word, PDFs, YouTube, all that stuff. And when I have Safari on, I have like tons of tabs, like at least 20 open at a time, like all the time pretty much. And on the second day, I could use it for about a half day. Now, because I was using Zoom and Audio Movers, there was quite a bit of energy being used. If I hadn't been using Zoom, I'm gonna guess I probably could have gone through the whole day without charging again. So that's like 2 days of pretty intense office school type work, and also using Sibelius too. After about almost a week of using this computer, the fastest I've seen the fan run was at about 1,500 RPM, as I've mentioned in some comments, and some people have been asking, is that loud? And you can hear maybe right now that there's a subway going by in the road. I'm living in Queens right now. It's never quite quiet in New York, and even when the fans are at the full 1500, I don't hear the fan at all. With my old computer, with the fans running constantly at like 5000 RPM, you could definitely hear it way louder than any ambient noise of New York. With this computer right now so far, even with my ear very close to it at 1500 RPM, it's barely audible. Okay, now for test 2, I'm just going to be loading individual articulations in Kontakt and we'll see how many instruments we can get to before either the RAM or the CPU starts to fail. In theory, I think we will have a lot more tracks that I will be able to load. However, this time I am using an actual melody. Super easy. Do, re, mi, fa, mi, re, do, so, do. I don't know if I was in the right key, but yeah. So that is the melody. It's obviously we're not changing different articulations in the melody. And right now for part A of this second test, what I did is basically I just loaded up every articulation available for violin 1 in Spitfire chamber strings. You can see each of these is different. Some people have suggested just, why don't you just copy and paste each track and just see how many instances we can get. And that is a way to test it, but I'm more curious how it handles having different instruments, because if you have the same patches loaded in different instances of Kontakt, I believe it still does share the RAM, which means you're not stressing it as much as you would be. Yep, not a single stutter, very smooth. Let's see our RAM. So far we are at 17 gigs of RAM. I purged the RAM before starting in between the two tests. And when I did purge it, we were basically at around 7 gigs of RAM. Right now we are at 17 gigs of RAM. Of course, that means if you're on 16 gigs of RAM, you might be running into swap issues already. Okay, stay tuned. I'm going to do the exact same thing, but with violin 2. RAM, only at 20 gigabytes of RAM, no swap used. Not a problem once again.
A few moments later.
Okay, we made it all the way down the string orchestra. I have all the way down to the double basses, starting at the first violins. We ended up at 178 tracks. I haven't gone into the ensemble patches. I think I won't. I think I'm going to carry on with a different library now. But yeah, as you will see in a couple moments, it plays flawlessly and there is plenty of RAM headroom. The CPU is hovering around 50% when we were playing it. Of course, I did move around the octaves a little, but basically everything is playing the same MIDI track. We've got everything from consordino, legato,
solo-ponte legato, disco falls, shorts of all kinds of lengths, measured tremolo, regular tremolo, muted, solo-tasto,
Basically, there's just so many articulations in chamber strings, and I was able to load every single one except for the ensemble patches, and the CPU has no problem at all. We are barely using half of the RAM. Of course, if you're getting 32 gigs of RAM now, we're at the point where we might start using swap data. But even with 32 gigs of RAM, you could write the coolest string piece in the world with 178 different types of tracks and have no problems. So the first test was a little disappointing, but admittedly that is a very stressful test, and the RAM was fine and the CPU was the bottleneck. So the M1 Max processor is maybe not enough for heavy templates like that, but so far with almost 200 tracks, it's fine. Okay, next update, I think I'm going to add in Berlin woodwinds, again doing all the individual tracks or as far as I can go. So we'll see you at the next update.
More moments later.
Alright, you guys are now watching me at 223 tracks. I've loaded all of the Berlin woodwind piccolos and the flute 1s and the flute 2s, and now we are finally starting to get into system overload territory. Even as I was loading the instruments, you could see that the CPU was spiking quite a bit. By the time I had loaded in all the flute ones, which is 207 tracks, you could see that one of the cores out of the 10 was basically peaking and the others were kind of around the 75% area. And now I finally ran into a system overload when I tried playing this with all the flute 2s loaded at 223 tracks. Let's see if it works again. There we go. So there is still some system overloading. I think it was able to play the first bit because some of these articulations, like the special effects and stuff, don't have any notes playing in that first bit. But once we get into this, maybe starting at the E on, we're starting to get all the notes coming in and the CPU can't take it. See its peak right there. I'm gonna try playing it again. And there we have a system overload. So it looks like maximum tracks again is going to be around the early 200 mark. RAM, I'm only at 42 gigs of RAM. So yeah, again, interestingly, the CPU is still the bottleneck. I thought that with these M1 Max processors, that the CPU would have tons and tons of headroom, especially with all these cores and the benchmark tests outperforming stuff like the Mac Pro. Still, with these Kontakt instances, these aren't even synths, by the way, they're just samplers, which are notoriously heavy on RAM. The RAM is fine, and the CPU is the bottleneck. Let me see if I can find a sweet spot where we don't actually run into any system overloading. So I'm going to take out 5 tracks, see how we do. So still system overload. Let's take out another 6. Okay, we're still system overloading. How's the fan, by the way? Fan, we are still at 0 RPM. So the fan is not the issue. Heat is not the issue. At the touch, it's not hot at all. It's not a thermal throttling issue. It's just the sheer number of tracks. Screen capture is using 20%. Okay, so that's probably what it is. When I wasn't screen capturing and I tried the flute ones, there was no system overload. Similarly, at least halfway through the flute 2s, I could still get it playing, even though I don't really remember where it was. However, it is basically at the limit because I did get a system overload without screen recording when I got to the end of the flute 2. So I think we can all safely say that around 220 tracks of Kontakt can be handled pretty easily on the M1 Max, and the fans aren't the issue, the RAM is not the issue, and it is just the multi-core performance of the CPU. Let's look at my logic settings to see if there's anything that maybe you guys can suggest. So this is what I have everything set to. Processing thread is automatic. This is at medium. This is what I have. So if there's any setting that might enhance this more, let me know. I'm actually pretty surprised because I don't feel like any of this was actually a stress test because the fans aren't going off. We're not using any swap memory. It's just that a couple of the cores are peaking over 100% for a moment, so logic just overloads. It's very interesting. All I've been saying for the last few minutes was this is very interesting. Yeah, it's honestly been a little disappointing. The M1 Max is weaker than I expected, even with the 8 power cores and 2 efficiency cores. Now that reminds me, what if I turn on high power mode or whatever that was? Will that make any difference? So I will go into the battery settings, I believe. Power adapter, energy mode, high power. This may result in louder fan noises, but we will get higher performance. Okay, let's see again. We're still getting the system overload despite having high power mode on. Yeah. So actually it looks like we're not getting the happy ending that all of these tech YouTubers and video editors are raving about with the M1 Max. There's actually quite a bit of CPU limitations. While I did totally think that this would be the perfect computer that kind of would be the be-all, end-all, at least for the next few years, already it looks like maxing out the CPU is not that difficult with logic. Yeah, I'm at a loss for words. I was kind of anticipating that it would blow all of these tests out of the water, and I'd be able to load in like 400 instances of Kontakt before the RAM maxes out. I thought the CPU would handle it like a champ all the way to the end, but my expectations were broken. And this is why science is important, right? Not that this test is scientific at all. I'm just going for it with this. We are at full charge. Now that I have high power mode on, the fan is going up to 1500. Yeah, we're still screen recording. It's very interesting to see this result. Again, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. I'm going to do a synth test next week. Seeing that the CPU can't handle these Kontakt instances, maybe it can't handle that many synth tracks either. It's going to be interesting to see that. So stay tuned for next week, ring the notification bell and subscribe to make sure you catch that video as soon as it comes out. This has been D.I.D. Choi, and I will see you in the next one.